Some mistakes vanish in silence. Others explode into consequences no one can escape. On a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to New York, the crew of Aurora Flight 418 thought they were making a routine decision. They looked at a quiet black woman in simple clothing and assumed she didn't belong in Seat 1A, the crown jewel of first class. With arrogance sharpened by prejudice, they tried to push her aside. But what they didn't know was that woman was Dr. Amara Sinclair, a visionary entrepreneur and the newly appointed owner of the very airline they worked for. What happens when arrogance collides with authority? When prejudice stands face to face with power, grace, and unshakable resolve? Would you have remained calm in her position, or would anger have broken through? How far can silence go before it becomes complicity? And in the span of 5 minutes, how can a flight crew destroy not only their own credibility, but their entire careers? This is more than just a story about a seat on a plane. It's a story about dignity, justice, and the price of underestimating someone who never needed permission to belong. If you believe prejudice should never fly, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. Some mistakes are easy to cover with a smile and a half-hearted apology. Others are so public, so breathtakingly careless, that they erase entire careers in the span of minutes. On Aurora Air Flight 418, a single miscalculation would change everything. The story began quietly, almost forgettably, in the private lounge at San Francisco International Airport. The atmosphere there was deliberately hushed, a carefully curated oasis designed to make travelers feel cocooned away from the chaos of the main terminal. Soft jazz leaked from discreet speakers, the gentle clinking of porcelain cups mixed with the faint hum of air conditioning. For most passengers, this was luxury, a rarefied treat before a long-haul flight. For Dr. Amara Sinclair, it was simply another room to wait in. She sat by the wide glass window, a leather satchel at her side. From there, she could see the dance of ground crews on the tarmac, each truck and tug moving in precise choreography. To anyone watching her, she looked like a woman passing time, absorbed in quiet observation. Her clothes were intentionally understated: a pair of dark gray trousers, a cream-colored blouse tucked neatly at the waist, a tailored navy cardigan. Her shoes were low-heeled leather, practical but refined. On her wrist sat a watch, simple, elegant, a detail so subtle most people's eyes would skim right past it. The choice was deliberate. Amara had long ago learned that wealth broadcast loudly invited assumptions. She had no need to prove herself with diamonds or designer logos. Power worn loudly was fragile. Power worn quietly, invisibly, that was unshakable. And Amara Sinclair understood power better than most. As the founder and CEO of Horizon Systems, a defense and aerospace firm that had recently stunned the industry by securing a multi-billion-dollar federal contract, she was accustomed to moving levers that shifted entire economies. Her voice could move markets. Her signature could open or close factories, and her decisions could ripple into the lives of thousands. But none of that mattered here. In this lounge, she was just another traveler waiting for her boarding call. And that, for Amara, was exactly the point. Her own Gulfstream G700 was grounded for avionics updates in Los Angeles. She could have delayed her trip or chartered another jet. But the idea of slipping unnoticed into a commercial first-class seat amused her. It would be, she thought, a chance to see how Aurora Air treated its passengers when nobody was watching. A chance for an undercover inspection. She didn't know yet how revealing that inspection would become. A voice broke through the hush of the lounge. Aurora Air Flight 418 to New York JFK is now boarding. First-class passengers, please proceed to Gate 72. Amara rose with a calm, unhurried grace, lifting her satchel by its worn handles. She had packed light a tablet loaded with reports, a slim binder of technical schematics, and a hardcover book of poetry she had been meaning to revisit. No entourage, no excess, just herself, the gate agent, a young man named Daniel, greeted her with a smile. His uniform was pressed, his voice crisp with hospitality. "Good evening, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass?" She held out her phone, the glowing QR code clear on the screen. He scanned it, and the machine chirped approval. His eyes flicked to the name, and his smile deepened. "Dr. Sinclair. Welcome aboard. Seat 1A. Straight down the jet bridge and to your left. Enjoy your flight." Amara returned the smile, genuine and warm. "Thank you, Daniel." The interaction was flawless, professional, exactly what she expected from Aurora's reputation as a boutique airline committed to premium service. She moved toward the jet bridge, her steps steady, her expression serene. But as soon as she crossed the threshold from the carpeted walkway into the aircraft galley, the atmosphere shifted. The air was no longer warm with welcome, but taut with something else: tension, edge voices, the residue of a private conversation interrupted too soon. Two flight attendants stood there, their backs half turned. One was a young woman, petite, with dark hair pulled tightly into a bun. Her eyes widened slightly at Amara's presence before she snapped on a practiced smile. The other, older, with a sharp blonde bob, didn't bother with a smile at all. Her arms were folded, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. Amara inclined her head politely. "Good evening. Just heading to my seat." The younger attendant, whose badge read Sophie Tran, stepped aside with a nervous little gesture. "Of course. Welcome aboard." But the older one didn't move. Her badge read Melissa Carter. Her eyes, cool and appraising, slid deliberately from Amara's cardigan to her shoes, lingering just long enough to communicate a message without words. A message Amara had received 1,000 times before. "Ah, you don't look like you belong here." It was subtle, just a flicker, but it was enough. Amara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not of fear, but of weary recognition. She had seen that look in lecture halls, in boardrooms, in gala ballrooms where she was the only black woman in a sea of faces that all blended into each other. Success, no matter how stratospheric, never seemed to immunize her from suspicion. She let out a slow breath. "My seat is 1A. Melissa's lips pressed into something that could have been a smile, though it carried none of the warmth of Daniel at the gate. "May I see your boarding pass?" It wasn't a request. It was a challenge. Amara lifted her phone again, the boarding pass still bright on the screen. The code had been scanned and confirmed not 2 minutes ago, but Melissa studied it as though she might catch it lying. Her silence stretched, waited with judgment. A thought passed briefly through Amara's mind. So this is how it's going to be. She felt the weight of decision inside herself, the same question she had asked 100 times before. Was it worth the confrontation? Would it be easier to step aside, avoid the scene, spare herself the indignity of becoming the spectacle? Her jaw set softly. "Not tonight." Melissa lowered the phone, her voice clipped. We've had glitches all evening. The first-class cabin is full. Economy Plus is down the main aisle, to the right." There it was, the first strike, clean and unmistakable. A dismissal delivered in the polite cadence of customer service, yet as sharp as any insult. Amara stood in the narrow galley, calm, steady, the hum of the aircraft filling the silence between them. The flight was only just boarding. Seat 1A was waiting, but already, the evening was beginning to fracture into something far more consequential. What Melissa didn't know, and what would soon become clear to everyone on that plane, was that she hadn't just picked a fight with a tired traveler. She had picked a fight with the woman who, as of 3 days earlier, owned the entire airline, and that mistake was about to cost her everything. The hum of boarding had begun to spill into the cabin. A line of passengers filtered in behind Amara, each carrying the faint mix of fatigue and entitlement that often came with first-class travel. Some murmured to one another, some stared down at their phones, already impatient. But in that narrow galley, between Melissa's rigid stance and Sophie's nervous glance, the air was taut with something invisible, yet heavy. Amara kept her voice calm. The gate agent confirmed my seat. 1A. Melissa tilted her head, the faintest curl tugging at one corner of her mouth. The system's been off all day. Happens more than you'd think. She gestured vaguely toward the aisle. Economy Plus is right this way. Let's not hold up the boarding process. Her tone was sugar-dusted with salt. A performance meant for the ears of the passengers now stepping onto the aircraft. To them, it would sound like routine problem-solving, but to Amara, it carried a sharp subtext. You don't belong here, and I'm going to make sure everyone sees it. Amara glanced past Melissa, toward the first-class cabin. She could see the gleaming leather seats, wide and waiting, the subtle golden light of the overhead panels. Seat 1A was empty, untouched. A pillow and blanket still neatly wrapped in plastic. A place that was hers, purchased fairly, validated already. Her heart gave a single, steady thump, not fast, not anxious, just firm. She had lived this moment before, in different forms. A college professor who had questioned her enrollment on the first day of class. A hotel concierge who had assumed she was staff instead of a guest. A venture capitalist who, in the middle of her pitch, had asked if she was the assistant instead of the founder. Each time, the same choice had presented itself: accept the dismissal quietly, or stand rooted and risk the fallout. She had never been one to back down. Why don't you scan it? Amara said, extending the phone again. Her voice carried no edge, no strain, just calm insistence. Melissa hesitated, then snatched the phone a bit too quickly, the motion sharp, almost aggressive. She pulled the scanner from her belt, its small screen blinking. A beep followed, and the device flashed green. Sophie's eyes flicked to Amara, then to Melissa, as if silently begging her colleague to relent. But Melissa's face didn't soften. Instead, her lips thinned. Like I said, the system's been unreliable today. She thrust the phone back, her eyes deliberately avoiding Amara's. Your seat's already taken. Must have been a double booking, a blatant lie. Amara didn't even need to glance again to know that 1A remained unoccupied. Still, she caught the subtle shuffle of the passengers behind her, the annoyed sighs, the muttered comments. She felt the weight of their impatience pressing against her back. That was part of Melissa's tactic: use public inconvenience as leverage. Shame her into compliance. For a moment, Amara considered simply brushing past, sliding into her seat without another word. But she knew that path would lead to escalation. Melissa would call security. The narrative would twist. The problem passenger would be her. Instead, Amara smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held no warmth but plenty of composure. Why don't we ask your purser to resolve this? The word landed like a pebble in still water. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. Melissa's eyes flashed. the faintest tremor of irritation breaking through her mask. To challenge her authority was to strip away the power she wielded in these tight aisles. "I can handle it," Melissa snapped, but the shuffle of footsteps interrupted her. A man in his early 50s approached from the cabin, his uniform neat but his expression weary. Edward Ross, the purser, carried himself with the tired patience of someone who had been solving disputes his entire career. His thinning hair and lined face suggested experience, but the resignation in his eyes betrayed something else, compliance. "Melissa, what's the issue?" Edward asked. "This passenger insists she's in first class," Melissa said, tilting her head toward Amara. Her voice softened for him, laden with exaggerated professionalism. "But the cabin's already at capacity. It's probably a glitch." Edward's gaze turned toward Amara, then down to her phone. But he didn't reach for it. He didn't ask to see the boarding pass himself. Instead, he sighed, a long exhale of inconvenience. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, soothing, paternal. "These things happen. Why don't we step back to the gate and get it sorted? We can't block boarding any longer." The line of passengers stretched deeper into the jet bridge now. A man in a blazer muttered audibly, "Some of us have connections." A woman behind him shifted her sunglasses up the bridge of her nose, lips tight with annoyance. Amara felt the heat of their stares, the unspoken verdict forming among strangers who didn't know her name, her history, her work. To them, she was already the problem. That was how prejudice worked, not always in raised voices or slurs, but in small assumptions, in the casual alignment of strangers against you before the facts were even considered. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with that old, familiar weariness. The same exhaustion she had felt at 21, walking into her first Ivy League lecture hall, the only black woman in the room. The same exhaustion that had followed her into boardrooms where her voice had to be louder, sharper, more precise just to be heard. Success had dulled none of it. But she wasn't here as a student or an employee anymore. She wasn't someone asking for permission to exist in a space. She was someone who owned the space, and that changed the calculus entirely. Her voice was soft when she spoke, but it cut cleanly through the muttering behind her. "No, we won't be going back to the gate. We'll be resolving this right here." Edward blinked, caught off guard by the firmness beneath her calm. Melissa stiffened, crossing her arms, a smirk tugging again at her lips. "You're holding up the line," she said, pitching her voice louder now so the passengers could hear. "This isn't helping anyone. That was the strategy, humiliation by audience. Make the woman the spectacle. Force her to crumble under the weight of collective impatience." But Amara had spent a lifetime being watched. She had learned how to turn an audience into a witness. Her gaze swept briefly across the line of first-class travelers. She saw impatience, yes, but also curiosity. A few watched with narrowed eyes. Sensing something wasn't right, she turned back to Edward. "My ticket says seat 1A. Your scanner confirmed it. The cabin isn't full. The simplest solution is for me to take my seat. If there's truly another passenger, we'll address it then." "Does that sound unreasonable?" Edward hesitated. His eyes darted to Melissa, searching for confirmation. And in that hesitation, Amara saw the truth. He wasn't a leader. He was a follower in a nicer uniform, leaning always toward the path of least resistance. Melissa seized the pause. That seat was pre-assigned to a Platinum Medallion member. She lied smoothly. "He was boarded early. We can't just move him. It's against policy to inconvenience our premier customers." There it was, the hierarchy spoken aloud. A hierarchy where loyalty points outweighed facts, where one passenger's fabricated status was more believable than another's verified ticket. Amara tilted her head, studying Melissa the way she might study a malfunctioning system. "So Aurora Air's policy," she said softly, "is to trust verbal claims over verified data, to invent passengers when the seat is clearly empty." Her words fell like pins in a silent room. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to the floor. Edward's face reddened. Melissa's jaw clenched. Amara stepped past Melissa's shoulder, not shoving, not rushing, simply moving with deliberate grace into the first-class cabin. Gas followed her. Melissa sputtered, "Ma'am, you can't just..." But Amara was already standing before seat 1A, pristine and empty, its blanket and pillow untouched. She turned slowly, her eyes steady, her silence louder than any argument. Melissa's face flushed with blotches of red, humiliation seeping through her mask. Edward opened his mouth, but no words came. Sophie looked stricken, torn between training and conscience, and behind them, passengers had gone quiet. They were no longer merely inconvenient strangers. They were witnesses now, witnesses to a lie, unraveling in real time. Amara didn't speak. She didn't need to. The empty seat spoke for her. It should have ended there, with an apology, a correction, a quiet seating. But prejudice, once engaged, rarely releases its grip so easily. Melissa's voice cut sharp through the silence. That seat was being held. She snapped. For him. She gestured vaguely toward the man in 1B, who looked up, startled. From his phone, he blinked, confused. "I don't need 2 seats," he muttered, before turning back to his screen. The absurdity of the claim hung in the air. The humiliation was now Melissa's, and yet, even then, she doubled down, as if sheer insistence could rewrite reality. Edward stepped forward, his voice lower now, firmer. "Ma'am," he said to Amara, "I'm going to have to ask you to step back into the galley. You're creating a disturbance." Amara's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "A disturbance," she repeated. "I present a valid ticket. I was denied entry. I was lied to. And now I'm accused of being the disturbance." Her words cut sharper than any raised tone. She tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, Edward, how do you think this looks to the other passengers?" The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Even Melissa faltered. Sophie's eyes shone with conflict. For a moment, Amara felt the weight of it all pressing inward. The humiliation, the weariness, the temptation to simply surrender her dignity for peace. A part of her whispered, "Let it go. Take the seat in economy. Walk away." But another voice, quieter yet stronger, rose within her. "If you yield, then this repeats. Not just for you, but for every woman who looks like you, for every girl watching." Her decision crystallized. Her presence alone was the answer. And so, standing calm in the aisle, with witnesses all around, Amara Sinclair held her ground. The cabin air seemed to thicken with every second of silence. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, torn between irritation and curiosity. Amara stood steady in the aisle, her bag still resting on her shoulder. Her eyes locked calmly on Edward Ross, the purser. The man's face had grown paler by the moment, as though the weight of authority pressing down on him was too heavy for his frame. Melissa Carter broke the stillness with a sharp breath through her nose, her arms folded, her body rigid as a drawn bowstring. She leaned slightly toward Edward, her voice pitched in a stage whisper meant for all to hear. She forced her way in. "I told you. That seat is already assigned. She's holding up everyone else. The lie hung in the air, bold and brittle. Amara let it rest there for a moment. She had learned that sometimes silence was more powerful than any rebuttal. Let them stack their falsehoods high enough, and eventually the structure collapsed under its own absurdity. But Edward, instead of questioning, nodded faintly, as though Melissa's insistence gave the claim substance. "Ma'am," Edward began again, his tone oily with practiced sympathy. "Please, let's step into the galley. We don't want this to escalate further." Amara's gaze did not waver. "It already has escalated, and it has escalated because your colleague has lied. Twice." Her words were cool, measured, but they sliced through the cabin like glass. The man in 1B shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking between Amara and the crew. He knew the seat beside him had been empty. Everyone could see it, yet none spoke. None wanted to draw the spotlight. Melissa's lips curved in a smug little line, as though she had expected this resistance, even welcomed it. Some people thrived on confrontation, mistaking cruelty for strength. She was one of them. "Security," Melissa muttered, her voice low but carrying. "We'll have to call security if this continues." That was the moment the murmurs in the cabin began. A ripple of whispers. Words like problem passenger and holding up the flight floated through the air. Amara felt the eyes on her back, the weight of strangers' judgment layering upon her. It was a familiar weight, one she had carried since youth. She thought of her first year in graduate school, when a professor had once told her she spoke too confidently for a student. She thought of the boardroom in Chicago, where she had presented a groundbreaking propulsion design and been asked, by a competitor's executive, whether she had really written it herself. Every time, the room had chosen sides before facts. Every time, she had stood alone against a tide of presumption. Her hand tightened briefly on the strap of her satchel. She inhaled, steadying herself. "I will not leave this cabin," she said finally. "My seat is 1A. That is the truth. The scanner confirmed it. I am standing before the empty seat right now, and yet I am being told I am the problem." The firmness in her voice caught Sophie Tran off guard. The younger attendant's eyes widened, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but fear clamped her jaw shut again. Her gaze dropped to the carpet, shame creeping across her face. Melissa gave a sharp laugh, though it sounded more brittle than amused. "I've been working in aviation for 15 years. I know when there's a mistake. The seat is reserved. If you don't move, we'll have no choice but to escalate." It was Edward who stepped forward then, his voice firmer this time, trying to reclaim authority. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Either step back into the galley or you will be removed from the aircraft. Removed." The word carried weight. For a split second, Amara felt the stirrings of anger rise beneath her calm, not at the threat itself, but at the utter ease with which it had been leveled, the speed with which suspicion turned into punishment when directed at someone who looked like her. Her heart whispered again, "Walk away. Spare yourself. They'll twist it no matter what." But another voice rose louder. "If you yield, you endorse it. You tell them they were right to treat you as less, and you tell every passenger watching that silence is safer than truth." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her tone remained calm. "If you attempt to remove me, you will be making a grave mistake." The cabin hushed. Even the murmurs paused. Melissa blinked, then scoffed. "A grave mistake. What are you going to do? Sue us?" Amara tilted her head, the faintest smile playing at her lips. "I don't need to sue you." The words carried no threat, no raised volume, but they landed with unsettling weight. Melissa faltered, her smirk wavering. It was then that the cockpit door opened. The sound of the latch clicking seemed louder than it should have been. Out stepped Captain Richard Hale, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his presence radiating the practiced authority of command. His eyes swept the scene, narrowing at the sight of a passenger standing firm against his crew. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice low but edged with steel. Melissa's posture straightened instantly. "Captain Hale, this passenger is refusing to take her assigned seat. She's attempting to sit in first class without authorization. She's disruptive, argumentative, and now threatening us." The lies poured forth smoothly, as if rehearsed. Edward nodded silently, backing her up. Sophie remained still, her gaze fixed on the floor, her silence its own quiet betrayal. Captain Hale turned his eyes on Amara. They were sharp, cool, dismissive. To him, she was not a passenger with a story. She was an obstacle. "Ma'am," he said, his tone leaving little room for discussion. "My crew has explained the situation. You have two options. You can accept a seat in Economy Plus, or you can deplane and take a later flight. Those are your choices." A finality hung in his words, as though he had delivered verdicts like this before and expected compliance. He did not ask to see her boarding pass. He did not question the contradictions. He did not investigate. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what she would do. Inside Amara, two forces warred. The exhaustion of a lifetime of these moments urged her to surrender, to step aside, to avoid the humiliation of being dragged away by security. But another force, deeper, stronger, whispered that she had not come this far to shrink. Not now. Not in front of these witnesses. Her eyes met the captain's, unflinching. She felt the weight of his authority pressing against her, but she knew authority built on bias was a hollow thing. She gave the smallest nod. "I understand my options perfectly," she said, her voice level. The captain seemed satisfied, as though victory was imminent. He turned slightly, ready to return to his cockpit. Melissa smirked again, triumphant. Edward exhaled, relieved. Sophie bit her lip, guilt gnawing at her. But Amara did not move toward the rear of the plane. Instead, she reached into her satchel, her fingers brushing against the cool casing of the satellite phone she always carried. A phone designed for moments when no ordinary network would suffice. Her hand closed around it. Her decision crystallized. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the owner of this moment, the arbiter of what came next. And for the first time, a ripple of unease flickered across Melissa's face. The stillness of the cabin was deceptive. Beneath it churned a storm of judgment, suspicion, and unspoken tension. Passengers in the first-class rows had turned their heads, some craning over seat dividers, others peering curiously above phone screens. They weren't just travelers anymore. They were an audience. Melissa Carter knew it. She thrived on it. With the captain's words behind her, she straightened her posture, her smirk blooming with renewed confidence. She had the authority of the uniform, the validation of her superior, and the silence of the passengers, who all wanted the same thing: to get on with their journey. "Ladies and gentlemen," Melissa announced, her voice pitched just high enough for the first rows to hear, "we apologize for the delay. We'll have this resolved quickly." Her eyes darted back to Amara with a glint of condescension, as if daring her to resist in front of this crowd. Amara remained still, her phone still in her hand, but not yet raised. She could feel the weight of eyes pressing on her, the unspoken irritation of strangers who did not know her story, her struggles, or her victories. To them, she was simply a disruption. An older man in a navy blazer muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. Some people don't know their place. The words, quiet as they were, sliced sharper than a shout. Amara heard them clearly, and though her expression did not change, something inside her shifted, hardening into resolve. She thought of her mother's voice years ago, telling her as a young girl, "You will always be asked to prove you belong. Never forget, you belong before you even step into the room." That memory steadied her now. Melissa pressed on. "Ma'am, you've heard the captain. You need to step out of this cabin." Her arms crossed over her chest, and she angled her body so the passengers could clearly see who was in the wrong, who was causing the delay. It was theater, pure and simple. Humiliation by spotlight. Edward Ross, standing slightly behind Melissa, added with false sympathy, "We can get you rebooked on the next flight with an upgraded seat in Economy Plus. It'll be more comfortable than standard economy. We're trying to help you." Amara raised her head slightly, her voice calm, steady, resonant. "Help me," she repeated. "You denied my verified seat. You lied about another passenger. You insisted this cabin was full while it is not. And now you're telling these travelers that I am the problem." Her gaze swept across the watching passengers, locking briefly with several pairs of eyes. A young woman looked away quickly, uncomfortable. A middle-aged man shifted in his seat, frowning faintly, perhaps realizing the imbalance. Most simply stared, unwilling to intervene. "This is not help," Amara continued softly. "This is prejudice, clothed in procedure." Her words were low, but they carried, threading through the still air of the cabin. Even Sophie Tran flinched, her face pale, as if the truth spoken aloud had struck her personally. Melissa's face flushed, though whether with anger or embarrassment was hard to tell. She took a half-step forward. "Ma'am, if you won't cooperate, I will call security right now. Do you understand? You'll be escorted off this aircraft." She wanted the spectacle. She wanted the visual of Amara being marched back up the jet bridge, passengers sighing in relief as the problem was removed. It would vindicate her narrative completely. But Amara did not flinch. She tilted her head slightly, regarding Melissa with the cool patience of someone examining a fragile system under stress. "Call security, then," she said evenly, "and let them explain to these passengers why a woman with a valid first-class ticket was removed for daring to insist on sitting in her assigned seat." Melissa blinked, caught off guard by the calm defiance. She hadn't expected compliance with the threat. She had expected pleading, anger, maybe even tears, something that would confirm her narrative of a disruptive passenger. But Amara's serenity unsettled her. Edward stepped forward again, his voice sharp now. "Enough. You're creating a scene. Captain Hale has already made the decision. If you don't step out now, we'll have you physically removed." A ripple of discomfort passed through the cabin. The words "physically removed" carried echoes of news stories, viral videos of passengers dragged from flights, lawsuits that had haunted airlines for years. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Amara let the silence stretch for a moment. She could feel the knot of tension in her chest, the old temptation to yield. But she knew if she stepped aside, it would not end here. She thought of Sophie's silent face, of every other junior employee who might one day witness injustice and believe silence was survival. If Amara gave in, she would confirm that belief. Her decision crystallized like steel. Slowly, she lifted the satellite phone from her satchel. The matte casing caught the cabin's light, its utilitarian design standing out against the sleek consumer devices around her. She pressed a single button. The line clicked instantly. "Marcus Lane," came the calm, professional voice of her chief of staff. "Marcus," Amara said softly, her eyes never leaving Melissa's. The quiet authority in her tone carried across the space, unsettling in its steadiness. "Protocol Indigo. Flight 418, San Francisco Gate 72. Immediate execution." The cabin froze. Passengers who had been shifting in irritation now stilled completely, sensing the gravity in her tone. Melissa frowned, confusion flickering across her features. Edward's lips parted, uncertain. Sophie's eyes widened, recognition dawning that something extraordinary had just been set in motion. "Understood," Marcus's voice replied through the phone. The faint clicking of keyboards echoed behind him. "Consider it done." Amara ended the call with a quiet press of her thumb. She slipped the phone back into her bag with unhurried precision, then looked calmly at the crew assembled before her. Melissa tried to recover, her voice brittle. What was that supposed to be? Some kind of threat. Amara did not answer. She simply turned and lowered herself gracefully into seat 1A, placing her bag neatly at her feet. It was the stillness, more than anything, that unnerved them. No shouting, no struggle, no scene, just calm, deliberate presence. Then the intercom crackled. Captain Hale's voice cut through, clipped and sharp. "Tower, this is Aurora Air 418. We are ready for pushback. Requesting clearance." The reply came after a beat of silence, flat and impersonal. "Aurora 418. Negative. Ground stop order on your aircraft. Hold position at Gate 72. Repeat. Ground stop order. Override priority Alpha." The words ricocheted through the cabin. Passengers looked at each other in confusion. Edward's face blanched. Melissa froze. Sophie covered her mouth with her hand. Captain Hale's voice returned, incredulous. "Ground stop." On whose authority were buttoned up and ready. The tower's response was sharp, final. Authority listed as Sinclair. Repeat Sinclair. Maintain position. Do not depart. The cabin erupted in whispers. The name rang through the air like a struck bell. Sinclair. Melissa's head whipped toward Amara, her face draining of color. Edward swayed slightly, gripping the seat back for balance. Sophie's eyes darted from Amara to the intercom, realization dawning, and in seat 1A, perfectly composed. Amara Sinclair folded her hands in her lap and gazed ahead, her presence steady as stone. The humiliation had flipped. The stage was still set, the audience still watching, but now the script had changed. Melissa Carter had no idea she was seconds away from becoming the villain of a story that would outlive her career. The cockpit door slammed open with more force than was necessary. Captain Richard Hale strode into the cabin, his jaw tight, his mustache bristling like the edge of a blade. His uniform was immaculate, his captain's stripes gleaming beneath the fluorescent cabin lights. Authority clung to him like a second skin, and he wielded it as though it could not be challenged. Behind him, the whispers of the passengers swelled, cresting like a tide. Some raised their phones discreetly, recording the strange unfolding drama. Others leaned into the aisles, eager to witness the clash between a passenger who refused to bend and a captain whose authority had never been questioned. Captain Hale's eyes landed first on Edward Ross, the purser, whose posture screamed unease, then on Melissa Carter, whose rigid stance had softened into something close to panic. Finally, his gaze fixed on Amara Sinclair, seated now in 1A, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face the very picture of calm composure. "What in God's name is going on here?" the captain demanded, his voice low but thunderous in its resonance. Melissa was quick to answer, seizing the chance to reclaim her narrative. "Captain, this passenger forced her way into the cabin. She doesn't have authorization for this seat. She's been argumentative, disruptive, and is refusing crew instructions. I tried to manage it, but she escalated." Edward nodded quickly, adding, "We attempted to de-escalate." "Captain, but she refused. We recommended Economy Plus, even offered rebooking, but she wouldn't cooperate." Their words hung heavy in the air, the same rehearsed story, polished with each retelling. To anyone not paying attention, it sounded convincing. To anyone watching carefully, it was unraveling at the seams. Captain Hale turned his gaze on Amara. His eyes were flat, impersonal, the eyes of a man accustomed to problems dissolving beneath his authority. "Ma'am, you heard my crew. You're out of options. You can accept a seat in Economy Plus, or you can leave this aircraft, but this plane does not leave the ground until you make that decision." The murmurs of passengers grew louder, feeding on the tension. Some muttered approval, siding instinctively with the captain and his crew. Others frowned, sensing the imbalance. The line between support and discomfort blurred. Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression unshaken. "Captain Hale," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to silence the whispers, "what you have just done is accept the most biased, irrational account of events without asking for a shred of evidence. Not once have you asked to see my boarding pass. Not once have you investigated. You have presented me with an ultimatum based solely on hearsay." The captain's jaw flexed. "My crew, your crew," Amara interrupted gently, "lied to you. They told you the seat was occupied when it was not. They told you I was disruptive when I was not. And you believed them without hesitation. That is not command. That is convenience." Her voice did not rise, but the firmness within it was impossible to ignore. Some passengers straightened in their seats, their expressions shifting, the certainty of earlier assumptions cracking. Melissa sputtered, her face reddening. She's twisting things. Captain, she's making a scene because she wants to sit in a seat she didn't pay for." Amara turned her gaze to Melissa, steady and piercing. "Melissa Carter," she said, the use of her name sharp as a blade. "You are not just lying. You are attempting to weaponize humiliation. You thought the audience of these passengers would shield your deceit, but all you've done is expose yourself." Melissa flinched, her lips parting, but no sound coming forth. Amara shifted her eyes back to the captain. "And you, Captain Hale, with all your authority, have chosen to wield it not in service of fairness, but in service of expedience. That is a failure far greater than hers." The words struck like a hammer against glass. The silence in the cabin deepened, the audience transfixed. Even Sophie Tran, who had been silent through it all, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the truth laid bare. For a brief flicker, Captain Hale hesitated. He was a man unaccustomed to being challenged, yet the composure of the woman before him unsettled him. Still, his pride was too entrenched. "Enough," he snapped. "You are becoming a security concern. If you don't comply immediately, I'll have you removed. Final warning." There it was, the nuclear option. To escalate a passenger dispute into the realm of federal offense. The kind of accusation that could destroy reputations in a single stroke. Amara closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a breath that carried years of exhaustion. She had known this script before it played out. The pattern was always the same assumption: dismissal, escalation, punishment. It had happened in classrooms, in boardrooms, in airports, in restaurants, and each time, she had been told she was the disruption for daring to exist outside the box they had built for her. But this time was different. This time, she was not the powerless girl or the overlooked woman. She was the owner of the stage. The disease she had just purchased had revealed itself before she even took her seat. Her eyes opened, calm and unwavering. "Very well, Captain," she said softly. "If those are my only options, then I will make a third." Her hand slipped once more into her satchel. She withdrew the satellite phone, its weight solid, undeniable. She pressed a single button. "Marcus," she said into the receiver, her voice steady, unhurried. "Confirm ground stop status." The reply came instantly. Marcus's tone clipped, efficient, confirmed. "Flight 418 is under Protocol Indigo. Tower has acknowledged aircraft is not authorized to depart under any circumstance." Amara closed the phone, setting it gently on the tray table before her. Then she looked up at the captain, her eyes meeting his with calm finality. "You no longer command this plane." The words were quiet, almost intimate, yet they detonated in the cabin like thunder. Captain Hale's face blanched, then flushed crimson. "What the hell are you talking about?" he barked. "Who do you think you are?" Before Amara could answer, the intercom crackled again. The tower's voice was cold, clipped, absolute. "Aurora 418. This is tower operations. Maintain gate position. Ground stop remains in effect. Do not close doors. Await further instructions from corporate command." The captain froze, his authority undermined not by the woman before him, but by the disembodied voice of the tower itself. Melissa's face drained of color, panic overtaking her smugness. Edward looked at the floor, his posture collapsing into shame. Sophie's eyes darted between Amara and the crew, realization dawning slowly, painfully, and the passengers. Oh, the passengers sat in stunned silence. The story they thought they were watching had flipped. The woman dismissed as a disruptive nobody had just grounded an entire aircraft. Amara's voice broke the silence, steady as stone. "Who am I?" she said, answering the captain at last. "I am Dr. Amara Sinclair, owner of Horizon Systems, and as of last week, the owner of Aurora Air." A collective gasp rolled through the cabin like a wave. Phones lifted higher, capturing every word, every face. Captain Hale staggered back a step, his expression collapsing into disbelief. Melissa's lips trembled. Edward closed his eyes, as though bracing for impact. Sophie let out a tiny gasp, tears pricking her eyes. Amara folded her hands neatly on her lap again. "Serene. Now," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. "Shall we continue this conversation with the truth?" The name hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. "Dr. Amara Sinclair." Passengers repeated it in hushed tones, some with dawning recognition, others with disbelief. The quiet hum of smartphones recording had grown louder, the faint buzz of cameras capturing the moment that was no longer just a passenger dispute, but a spectacle. Melissa Carter's knees wobbled beneath her. She had spoken down to this woman, lied to her face, dismissed her as an inconvenience, and now, in the cold clarity of hindsight, every word she had uttered replayed in her mind like a curse. Her breath came shallow, her throat dry. her face flushing with the shame of realization. Edward Ross leaned against the bulkhead, the color draining from his cheeks. The purser, a man who had built his career on quiet compliance, now stood exposed. His silence, his quick agreement with Melissa's narrative, had placed him on the wrong side of judgment. Captain Richard Hale's fury was visible. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but beneath the anger was fear, a gnawing recognition that his authority had just been eclipsed by someone he could not overrule. Sophie Tran trembled near the galley. Tears pricked her eyes, not from guilt alone, but from the sheer magnitude of what she was witnessing. She had seen injustice before, small, everyday injustices that passed with a shrug and silence. But never had she seen one unravel so completely, so publicly, in the space of minutes. The intercom crackled again. "Aurora 418. This is Operations Control. Corporate directive incoming. Stand by." The words landed heavily. Corporate directive. Everyone on board understood the significance. In the airline world, corporate directives were rare, powerful, unquestionable. They overrode even the captain's command. A sudden clatter echoed from the jet bridge. Shoes pounded against the metal walkway. A moment later, 3 men appeared in the cabin doorway, their suits wrinkled from haste, their faces pale with stress. At the front was Jonathan Park, Chief Operating Officer of Aurora Air. His usual composure was gone. His tie hung loose, his hair damp with sweat. His chest heaved as he scanned the cabin, his eyes locking immediately on Amara. "Dr. Sinclair," he gasped, his voice trembling. "My God, I came as soon as I received the call." Passengers gasped again. Melissa's hand flew to her mouth. Edward's knees nearly buckled. Sophie covered her lips, whispering a prayer under her breath. Jonathan stumbled forward, nearly tripping over a passenger's bag in the aisle. He righted himself, standing before Amara like a man awaiting judgment. "Dr. Sinclair," he repeated, his voice cracking with urgency. I am profoundly sorry. There has been a catastrophic misunderstanding." His words spilled out like water from a cracked dam. "This behavior, this treatment, it does not reflect Aurora's values. It does not reflect my leadership. It is unacceptable. Entirely unacceptable." Melissa swayed on her feet, her eyes wide with horror. Edward stared at the floor, wishing he could vanish into the carpet. Captain Hale remained rooted, rigid, his pride preventing him from breaking even as the truth swallowed him whole. Amara leaned back slightly in her seat, her expression serene. Her calm was more unnerving than any display of anger. She let Jonathan's words tumble forth unchecked, his desperate apologies filling the silence. Only when he stopped to draw breath did she finally speak. "Mr. Park," she said softly. The COO's eyes snapped up, relief flashing across his face at being acknowledged. "You are just in time. We were in the middle of a case study." The passengers leaned in, straining to hear her words. The crew stiffened. Even Jonathan looked confused, his apology faltering. Amara rose smoothly from her seat, her presence commanding the cabin with quiet gravity. She turned first to Melissa. "Miss Carter," she began, her tone precise, cutting. "Your role is to be the face of Aurora's customer experience. Instead, you became its greatest liability. You lied repeatedly. You escalated conflict rather than resolved it. You humiliated a paying passenger in front of others. Do you understand what that makes you?" Melissa shook her head desperately, tears brimming in her eyes. It was a misunderstanding," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean—" "My company does not subsidize your bad days," Amara said, her voice cold as steel. "Intentions are irrelevant when the result is systemic prejudice." Melissa crumpled into the nearest jump seat, burying her face in her hands. Amara turned next to Edward Ross. "Mr. Ross, you were supposed to be the leader in this cabin. When faced with conflict, your responsibility was to investigate, to mediate, to ensure fairness. Instead, you chose the comfort of complicity. You accepted lies because they were easier than truth. You failed your crew, your passengers, and your uniform." Edward could not meet her eyes. His lips parted, but no defense came. His silence was its own confession. Amara's gaze shifted to Captain Hale. The man stood stiffly, his pride a brittle armor. "And you, Captain," she said quietly. Her voice carried the weight of profound disappointment. "You are entrusted with the ultimate authority aboard this aircraft. But authority is not a privilege. It is a burden. It requires fairness, sound judgment, impartiality. And what did you do? You took the word of your crew without question. You issued ultimatums rather than asking questions. You were ready to eject a ticketed passenger based on hearsay." Captain Hale's eyes narrowed, his face reddening. "I was protecting my crew," he snapped. "You were protecting your convenience," Amara replied evenly. "True leadership is not measured in how swiftly you silence dissent, but in how thoroughly you seek truth. And you failed." The captain's chest rose and fell sharply. For once, he had no retort. Finally, Amara's eyes softened as they turned to Sophie Tran. The young attendant trembled under her gaze, tears streaking silently down her cheeks. "And you, Miss Tran," Amara said gently, "you are new. You were afraid. I could see the conflict in you from the moment I stepped on board. You knew this was wrong, but you remained silent. Remember this lesson. Silence, in the face of injustice, is complicity. Let it guide you for the rest of your career, wherever it takes you." Sophie's lips trembled as she whispered, "I'm sorry." Amara nodded slightly, the faintest gesture of grace. Then she turned to Jonathan Park, whose face was slick with sweat. "Mr. Park, you have now seen firsthand the culture you are responsible for. A culture where lies outweigh truth, where prejudice masquerades as procedure, where authority is used as a shield for arrogance rather than a tool for fairness. This ends today." Jonathan swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. "Yes, Doctor. Sinclair. Yes, absolutely. Whatever you require." "Good," Amara said calmly. She looked back at the crew. "Effective immediately. Melissa Carter, Edward Ross, and Captain Richard Hale are relieved of duty, permanently. Their employment with Aurora Air is terminated for cause. Security will escort them from this aircraft." Gas filled the cabin. Melissa let out a choked sob. Covering her face, Edward closed his eyes, sagging against the bulkhead. Captain Hale's nostrils flared, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Sophie's eyes widened, stunned, but Amara's gaze returned to her, steady. "You, Miss Tran, will be reassigned. You have potential. Do not waste it in silence again." Jonathan nodded quickly, already signaling to security officers waiting just beyond the jet bridge. "Understood," he said breathlessly. Amara lowered herself back into seat 1A, her composure unbroken. She folded her hands again, her voice calm. "Now, Mr. Park, inform the passengers. They deserve to know this airline takes responsibility." Jonathan hesitated only briefly before seizing the intercom. His voice, trembling but clear, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Aurora Air, I want to extend my deepest apologies. What you witnessed today was unacceptable. Immediate action has been taken. As compensation, every passenger on this flight will receive a full refund and a complimentary round-trip voucher. We will be departing shortly with a new crew. A ripple of astonishment spread through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others began murmuring approval, even gratitude. A few phones stopped recording. The story had reached its climax. Amara leaned back into her seat, her eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the tarmac glowed under the floodlights, trucks and tugs frozen in place by the corporate command. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Not a sigh of relief, but one of resolve. This wasn't victory. It wasn't vengeance. It was accountability. A first incision in a system she now owned. The real work, rebuilding the culture, reshaping the values, lay ahead. But tonight, a lesson had been carved into stone, and everyone on board would remember it. The walk of shame was long and heavy. Security officers appeared at the cabin door, their presence quiet but immovable. Melissa Carter resisted at first, her voice breaking as she pleaded, "It wasn't like that. I swear I didn't mean." Her protest dissolved into sobs as she was guided gently but firmly toward the jet bridge. Edward Ross followed, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. He looked less like a leader of a cabin crew and more like a man condemned by his own cowardice. His lips moved silently, whispering words only he could hear, as though rehearsing excuses he would never get the chance to utter. Captain Richard Hale came last. Unlike the others, he did not falter. His back was straight, his chin lifted, his stride brisk with defiance. His face was a mask of cold fury, the kind of pride that refused to admit failure, even as the ground fell away beneath him. To the passengers, he looked like a deposed king, stripped of his throne, yet unwilling to bow. Sophie Tran remained at the front of the cabin, trembling, watching the others vanish down the jet bridge. She didn't move. She didn't speak. For her, the moment was not punishment, it was survival. When the door closed behind them, a hush fell over the cabin. It was the silence after a storm, heavy and fragile. Passengers exchanged glances, some uneasy, some wide-eyed with disbelief. A few whispered to one another, but no one spoke loudly. They all seemed to know they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Amara Sinclair sat quietly in seat 1A, her bag tucked beneath the seat, her posture serene. She had not smiled, not once during the ordeal, and she did not smile now. For her, there was no joy in this, only the grim satisfaction of a system held accountable. Jonathan Park, still pale with shock, stood near the intercom. His hand shook slightly as he returned the receiver to its hook. He turned toward Amara, his voice quiet, deferential. "Doctor, Sinclair, a replacement crew is on the way. They'll be here in minutes. I've already given instructions to operations." Amara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging him. "Good. See to it that the passengers are comfortable in the meantime." Jonathan nodded quickly. "Yes, of course." He turned to address the passengers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, refreshments will be served as we wait for the new crew. Please accept our apologies for the delay." His words were smoother this time, his executive polish slowly returning. As Jonathan moved toward the galley, Amara leaned back into her seat. For the first time since boarding, she allowed herself to exhale deeply. Her chest loosened, but only slightly. The truth was, she felt no triumph, no victory. What she felt was heavier exhaustion, It wasn't just this incident. It was every moment that had led to it. The professors who had doubted her, the executives who had questioned her competence, the investors who had underestimated her because of her skin, her gender, her calm refusal to fit into their stereotypes of power. Yet tonight had been just another scene in a play she had performed all her life. Her eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the tarmac lights glowed in a steady rhythm, illuminating the silhouettes of ground crew frozen in place, waiting for instruction. To them, this was just another flight delay. But to her, it was proof of how deep the rot had spread inside this company she now owned. A soft voice pulled her back. "Doctor." Sinclair Amara turned her head. Sophie Tran stood in the aisle, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes wide and wet with tears. She looked young, far younger than her uniform suggested. "Yes," Amara replied softly. Sophie swallowed hard. Her voice cracked. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have said something. I knew it was wrong. From the beginning. She faltered, her words breaking under the weight of her guilt. "I was afraid. I didn't want to lose my job." Amara studied her for a long moment. Sophie's fear was real, raw. It was the fear of someone caught between conscience and survival, a fear Amara knew intimately. "You're young," Amara said gently, "and fear is a powerful teacher. But remember, this silence in the face of injustice is not safety. It is surrender. And surrender only feeds the very thing you fear." Sophie nodded, her tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'll remember. I promise." Amara's gaze softened. "See that you do, because the world will test you again. And when it does, you'll need to choose." Sophie inhaled shakily, wiping her eyes before stepping back, her shoulders straighter than before. Moments later, the cabin door opened again. This time, a new crew entered. Their presence was different, calm, efficient, professional. The new purser, a woman in her 40s with steady eyes and a commanding yet kind demeanor, approached Amara first. "Dr. Sinclair," she said quietly, inclining her head with respect. "My name is Angela Ruiz. It's an honor to serve you tonight. Please let us know if there is anything you require." Amara offered a faint smile, weary but sincere. "Just a safe and punctual journey." "Miss Ruiz," Angela nodded firmly. "Consider it done." The new crew dispersed, moving with practiced precision. They began offering water, adjusting seats, addressing passengers with a courtesy that felt genuine rather than forced. The contrast was stark. The cabin's tension eased, conversations resumed, quiet but less strained. Jonathan Park remained near the galley, his phone pressed to his ear, whispering rapid instructions to someone at headquarters. His eyes darted nervously toward Amara every few seconds, as if to reassure himself she was still there, still watching. Amara opened her leather satchel and withdrew a thick folder of documents, technical schematics, proposals, diagrams, work she had intended to review during the flight. She placed it on the tray table before her, but did not open it. Her mind was elsewhere. She thought of the passengers who had witnessed everything. How many of them had judged her before the truth was revealed? How many had believed Melissa's lies? She thought of the man who had muttered, "Some people don't know their place." Was he watching now, rethinking his words, or would he carry his prejudice with him, unchanged, into the night? Her chest tightened with the weight of it. She did not crave their admiration. She did not even crave their apologies. What she wanted, what she demanded, was change, and that was far harder to win. The engines outside began to rumble softly as the aircraft was prepared for departure. The new crew moved with crisp efficiency, their professionalism a balm after the storm. Passengers settled in, some whispering about refunds and vouchers, others still murmuring about the woman in 1A. Amara leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes closing for a moment. The fatigue pressed in, heavy, relentless. She thought of Marcus Lane, her chief of staff, waiting in Virginia. She thought of the board meeting that would inevitably follow this incident. She thought of the systemic reforms she would demand. It would not be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was. But tonight had proven one thing. The disease within Aurora Air was real. And now, the cure had begun. Amara opened her eyes as the safety demonstration began. Her lips pressed into a thin line, neither smile nor frown. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about accountability. And she was just getting started. The cabin doors sealed with a heavy thud. Outside, the jet bridge retracted, groaning as it pulled away from the aircraft. For the first time in what felt like hours, the air inside the cabin shifted. It was no longer thick with confrontation and judgment. It was lighter, steadier, filled with the quiet murmur of passengers preparing for departure. Angela Ruiz, the new purser, moved down the aisle with a kind of calm authority that seemed to reset the atmosphere. She greeted each passenger with genuine warmth, her voice even, her smile soft. The other attendants mirrored her professionalism, their presence efficient and unshaken. It was as though the entire cabin had been rewoven in minutes. Jonathan Park stood near the galley, his phone still in his hand. His tie was straighter now, his posture stiffer. He was slowly regaining the shell of an executive, though the tremor in his fingers betrayed how rattled he remained. He didn't dare approach Amara again. He simply hovered at the edges, waiting for her signal. Amara Sinclair sat quietly in 1A, her satchel tucked beneath the seat, her body composed but weary. She had not spoken since her verdict. She had no need to. The silence surrounding her was no longer hostile. It was reverent, watchful. Passengers who had once doubted her now whispered her name with awe. The safety demonstration began. Amara watched with detached attention, though she already knew every word. Her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts heavy. The engines roared to life, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floor beneath her feet. The aircraft began to push back from the gate, the runway lights outside shimmering like a necklace of stars. Passengers fell silent, some gripping armrests, others closing their eyes. The familiar ritual of departure took hold. As the plane taxied, Amara closed her eyes briefly. The hum of the engines blended with the steady announcements, creating a cocoon of sound. But inside her mind, the storm still raged. She thought of Melissa Carter's face, twisted with arrogance, then crumbling into fear. She thought of Edward Ross's weakness, the way he had folded into silence. She thought of Captain Hale's pride, brittle and unyielding even as it shattered. And she thought of Sophie Tran Young, afraid, silent, but not beyond redemption. Her chest tightened as another memory surfaced. A boardroom in New York, 10 years earlier. A proposal she had presented, revolutionary in design, flawless in execution. The older men at the table had nodded, their lips tight, their questions sharp but dismissive. Hours later, one of them had pulled her aside, his tone paternal. "You're talented," he had said, "but people like you need to learn humility. People like you." She had smiled then, polite, composed, refusing to let him see the fire his words had lit. Tonight, she had heard echoes of the same phrase. Some people don't know their place. The engines roared louder as the plane accelerated down the runway. The force pressed her back into her seat, the vibration shuddering through her chest. The wheels left the ground with a soft lurch, the cabin tilting upward, climbing into the dark California sky. The city lights below scattered like jewels against velvet. Amara stared out the window, her reflection faint against the glass. She did not feel relief. She did not feel triumph. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than ever. Aurora Air was hers now. Its failures were her failures. Its sickness was her burden to cure. Tonight had been a symptom, loud and undeniable, but she knew there were quieter symptoms, buried deeper, hidden in policies and practices, in training manuals and corporate cultures. To cure this disease, she would need more than authority. She would need resilience. She would need allies. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, Doctor. Sinclair." Angela Rue stood beside her seat, holding a tray with a glass of water. Her smile was respectful, steady. "Would you like anything to drink before meal service begins?" Amara looked at the glass, condensation beating along its surface. She accepted it with a quiet nod. "Thank you. This will do." Angela inclined her head. "If there is anything else, please don't hesitate." She moved on, her presence leaving a trail of calm in her wake. Amara sipped the water slowly, her eyes returning to the window. She thought again of Sophie. The young attendant had looked broken, but not beyond hope. Amara knew the weight of silence, the way fear of consequence could chain the tongue. But she also knew that every silent witness was a lost chance for justice. Her thoughts deepened. How many Sophies were scattered throughout this airline? How many Melissa Carters were leading them? How many Edward Rosses were failing to challenge them? How many Captain Hales were ruling their cabins with unchecked pride? The magnitude of the problem pressed against her, vast and daunting, but she did not shrink from it. She never had. A voice broke through the quiet, this time from across the aisle. "Dr. Sinclair." It was the man in 1B, the one who had smirked earlier as the drama unfolded. His phone was now tucked away. His expression had shifted from amusement to something closer to awe. "I just wanted to say—" He hesitated, searching for words. "What you did standing your ground like that, it was remarkable. I don't think anyone else could have done it." Amara regarded him calmly. "Anyone could have," she said softly. "The question is whether they would." The man nodded slowly, his cheeks flushing. He leaned back in his seat. Silent again, a woman in 2A caught Amara's eye, her expression one of quiet respect. She gave the faintest nod, acknowledging what had been done, what had been revealed. Amara inclined her head slightly in return. The ripple was subtle, but real. Perspectives had shifted tonight. Perhaps not for all, but for some, and that mattered. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane reached cruising altitude. Outside, the stars glittered across the sky, infinite and indifferent. The hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm, a heartbeat in the silence. Amara opened her satchel again, pulling out the folder of schematics. She laid it open on the tray table, the pages filled with complex diagrams and equations. For a long moment, she stared at the lines and numbers without seeing them. Her mind was elsewhere on Aurora's future, on the battles to come, on the weight she carried not just for herself, but for every passenger who would one day walk onto one of her planes. She thought again of her mother's voice. Never forget, you belong before you even step into the room. Tonight. She had not just stepped into the room. She had claimed it. And tomorrow, she would begin reshaping it. She closed the folder again, sliding it back into her bag. She leaned her head against the seat, her eyes heavy, her body finally surrendering to fatigue. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to rest. Not in victory, not in defeat, but in resolve. The engines hummed steadily, carrying Aurora 418 eastward into the dark sky. And in seat 1A, Amara Sinclair sat in silence, her presence a quiet promise that the world would not remain unchanged. The cabin settled into a strange calm. Meal service began, trays sliding quietly onto tables, cutlery clinking gently. The atmosphere had shifted, no longer tense with conflict, but alive with curiosity, awe, and an undercurrent of reflection. The passengers weren't just travelers anymore. They were witnesses to an extraordinary moment, one that would be retold countless times once wheels touched down. Amara Sinclair ate little. The food sat mostly untouched on the tray before her. Her mind was elsewhere, drifting between exhaustion and resolve. Her gaze lingered on the glass of water, condensation pooling into a ring on the tray. The droplets caught the dim cabin light, shimmering like tiny stars. She found herself staring at them longer than she realized. A voice interrupted her reverie. "Doctor, Sinclair." It was the man from 1B again. He leaned slightly toward her, his tone quieter this time, less performative than before. "I know you probably don't want to be bothered, but may I ask you something?" Amara turned her head, her expression neutral. "You may ask." He hesitated, then spoke. "When they were treating you that way, when it was 3 of them against you, plus the captain, how did you stay so calm? I would have lost it." Most people would have. Amara studied him for a long moment before answering. "Calm doesn't mean I wasn't angry," she said softly. "It means I refused to give them control over my reaction. Anger is fuel, but if you let it spill everywhere, it burns you first. Sometimes calm is the sharpest blade you can carry." The man nodded slowly, his eyes dropping. He looked younger now, stripped of the smugness he'd worn earlier. "I think I understand." Across the aisle, the woman in 2A leaned forward slightly. "If you don't mind me saying, Dr. Sinclair, I think what you did tonight, it's going to stick with all of us. I travel for work all the time. I've seen attendants roll their eyes at people who didn't look like they belonged in premium cabins. I've stayed quiet every time. Tonight I'm realizing that silence was just complicity." Her words trailed off, heavy with realization. Amara inclined her head, her eyes steady. "Recognition is the first step, but the next time you see it, you'll have a choice to make. Remember that." The woman pressed her lips together, nodding, her gaze dropping to her lap. The ripple spread. Passengers whispered quietly to one another, glancing at Amara, glancing at the empty spaces where Melissa, Edward, and Captain Hale had once stood. The story had already taken root. By the time the plane landed, it would be retold dozens of times, reshaped, magnified. By morning, it would live online, on news outlets, on forums, on feeds. Jonathan Park, seated now 2 rows back, shifted uneasily. He knew this. He knew the public relations tidal wave that was forming. He also knew that for once, damage control wasn't in his hands. It was in hers. Amara leaned her head back, closing her eyes briefly. Her body ached with fatigue, though her posture betrayed none of it. She thought of Marcus Lane, no doubt already drafting memos, already preparing statements, already weaving this night into the fabric of reform. He would know what to do. He always did. But Marcus couldn't carry what she carried. The memories pressed in again, boardrooms where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by a man, airport lounges where attendants assumed she didn't belong, hotel receptions where she was asked if she was with the staff. Tonight was not an anomaly. It was the pattern, amplified. She opened her eyes to the darkened cabin. The hum of the engines filled the silence. A soft sound drew her attention. Sophie Tran, the young attendant, was standing just beyond the curtain, her hands twisting nervously at her waist. She hesitated before stepping forward. "Doctor Sinclair," she whispered, her voice trembling. "May I speak with you?" Amara gestured for her to approach. Sophie's eyes glistened with tears. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her words spilling out quickly. "Not just for what you did for standing your ground, but for what you said to me about silence. I've been silent before. I saw things in training, in flights, comments, looks, little jokes. I told myself it wasn't my business, that it was safer not to get involved." Her voice cracked. "But tonight I saw where that silence leads, and I hated myself for it." Amara studied her, her face unreadable. "And what will you do with that hatred, Sophie?" Sophie blinked. I don't know. You'll turn it into something better," Amara said firmly. "Hatred of injustice is only useful if it becomes action. Otherwise, it eats you from the inside. The next time you face that choice, remember this night and decide who you want to be." Sophie swallowed hard, nodding through her tears. "I will. I promise." Amara's gaze softened slightly. "Good. Then this night was not wasted." Sophie stepped back, her posture straighter, her expression steadier. For the first time that evening, she looked less like a frightened trainee and more like someone who might one day find her own strength. Amara leaned back again, her eyes drifting once more to the window. Clouds glowed faintly in the moonlight, stretching endlessly below them. For a fleeting moment, the view felt like a metaphor, layers of obscurity hiding the truth, waiting to be pierced. The man in 1B cleared his throat gently. "Doctor Sinclair," he said, "quieter this time. What will happen to them, the crew you dismissed?" Amara did not turn her head. Her gaze remained on the stars. "They will move on. Perhaps they will learn. Perhaps they won't. Their choices are their own now. And you," the man pressed cautiously. She exhaled slowly. "I will carry the responsibility, because their failures revealed mine too. This airline's culture is mine to repair now. And if I fail, then all of this will have been for nothing." The weight in her voice silenced him. He leaned back, his eyes wide, with a respect he had not felt before. The cabin dimmed further as the crew prepared passengers for rest. Some reclined their seats, pulling blankets over themselves, trying to sleep. Others scrolled through phones, no doubt drafting the first words of stories that would spread before the plane even landed. Amara closed her eyes again, but she did not sleep. Her mind raced with strategies, with reforms, with the immense task ahead. But beneath it all, a deeper current pulsed the ache of a lifetime of proving, again and again, that she belonged. It was a wound that never fully closed. Tonight had only torn it open again. And yet, within the ache, there was something else. Resolve, the knowledge that she had not backed down, that she had turned humiliation into accountability, silence into reform, prejudice into exposure. The engines hummed steadily, carrying them eastward into the long night, and in seat 1A, Dr. Amara Sinclair sat awake, her eyes closed but her mind burning, a solitary figure bearing the weight of both power and prejudice. The night stretched on, the engines a steady pulse beneath the dark sky. Most of the cabin had surrendered to slumber. Blankets rose and fell with quiet breathing, screens dimmed to black, and the hum of flight settled into a lullaby. But Amara Sinclair did not sleep. Her body ached with exhaustion, yet her mind refused to relent. She sat upright in 1A, her hands folded neatly, her eyes fixed on the stars beyond the glass. It wasn't restlessness, it was vigilance. A lifetime of carrying burdens had taught her that even in silence, the world pressed forward, demanding attention. She thought again of Sophie Tran's trembling apology, of the man in 1B's questions, of the woman in 2A's admission of complicity. The ripples from tonight's confrontation had spread already, reshaping thoughts, testing consciences. But ripples alone did not change oceans. Real change would require storms. Her jaw tightened at the thought. She knew she could create those storms, but she also knew the toll they would take. A faint shuffle drew her attention. Jonathan Park emerged from the galley, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt creased. He looked smaller now, diminished. Gone was the polished COO, the man of sharp lines and corporate presence. What remained was a man burdened by fear. He paused beside her seat, his voice hushed, as though afraid to disturb the fragile calm. "Dr. Sinclair," he said quietly, May I speak with you?" Amara turned her gaze to him. Her face revealed nothing. "You may." Jonathan lowered himself into the empty jump seat across the aisle. His hands fidgeted in his lap, his eyes darting nervously between her and the carpet. "I want to be honest," he began, his voice trembling. "When I first got the call when I heard you were on this flight, I panicked. Not because of the situation itself, but because I knew what it meant. You weren't just a passenger. You were the owner, and suddenly, every mistake, every failure, every blind spot in this company became my responsibility in front of you." His shoulders sagged. "I've spent my career keeping plates spinning, patching problems, making excuses when I had to. But tonight, there were no excuses. Everything was exposed." He looked up finally, his eyes desperate. "I don't know if I can fix it. I don't know if I'm the right person for this job under you." Amara studied him in silence for a long moment. The engines hummed between them. "Why do you think you are unfit?" she asked at last, her voice even. Jonathan swallowed hard. "Because I let this culture grow. I let people like Carter rise without questioning how they treated others. I signed off on training that emphasized efficiency over empathy. I told myself we were building a premium brand. But what we were building was arrogance." His voice cracked, and I never stopped it. Amara's eyes held his. "So you admit your failure?" Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. "Yes." Her expression softened only slightly. "Then the question is not whether you failed. The question is whether you will continue to fail." Jonathan blinked. I don't want to." "Wanting is not enough," Amara said. "Responsibility is not desire. It is action. If you remain in this role, you will not serve me. You will serve the people who trust this airline with their lives. If you cannot bear that, then you should resign before sunrise." Jonathan's breath caught. He bowed his head, his hands tightening together. "I understand." Amara leaned back slightly, her gaze returning to the stars. Good. Then prove it. For a long moment, Jonathan sat in silence, his chest rising and falling as he wrestled with the weight of her words. When he finally rose, he looked less defeated than before. Not strong, not steady, but resolute. He bowed his head slightly before returning to his seat. His figure swallowed again by the dim cabin. Amara exhaled quietly. She did not relish breaking him down, but leadership demanded honesty, and honesty was rarely gentle. The hours crept forward. Passengers shifted in their sleep. The engines droned steadily, carrying the aircraft across the expanse of night. At one point, the man in 1B stirred again, glancing at Amara. His voice was low, hesitant. "Doctor, Sinclair, may I ask you one more thing?" Amara tilted her head. "What is it? When you revealed who you were, when you said your name, did you feel vindicated?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. She considered the question carefully. "No," she said at last. "Revealing my name was not vindication, it was necessity. Vindication would have been them treating me with respect without knowing who I was." The man's eyes widened slightly. He nodded, sinking back into his seat. Amara's gaze returned to the window. The horizon was beginning to pale faintly, the first hints of dawn brushing against the edges of the sky. They were nearing their destination. With dawn came decisions, meetings, reforms, the long grind of reshaping a culture that had been allowed to decay. She felt the weight of it pressing on her shoulders already. But beneath the weight, there was something steadier, resolve. The PA system chimed. Angela Ruiz's calm voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial descent into New York. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." The cabin stirred awake. Blankets folded, trays cleared, seats upright. The rituals of arrival began. But beneath them all, a current remained, passengers still watching her, still whispering her name. Amara sat straighter, her hands resting lightly on her knees. She had boarded this plane as an anonymous passenger. She would leave it as a symbol, whether she wished it or not. As the plane dipped lower, the clouds parting to reveal the lights of the city below, Amara felt the ache in her chest ease just slightly. The night had been long. The work ahead would be longer still. But she was ready. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, the roar of reverse thrust filling the cabin. Passengers leaned forward, bracing themselves, the runway lights flashing past in rapid succession. When the aircraft slowed to its taxi, the hush lifted into murmurs again. Some passengers clapped softly, more in release than celebration. Others simply watched her, waiting for her next move. Amara remained still, her face calm, her gaze steady. She did not need to speak. Not yet. The plane rolled toward the gate, the engines quieting. The night was ending. Dawn had come, and with it, a reckoning. The seatbelt sign dinged, a soft chime that broke the fragile stillness. Passengers stirred awake, stretching stiff limbs, rubbing sleep from their eyes. The cabin lights brightened in stages, chasing away the shadows of the long night. Amara Sinclair remained composed in her seat, her bag already organized at her feet. She had not slept, but she carried herself with the same poise she had maintained since the beginning. The fatigue was there, tucked in the corners of her eyes, but so was the fire, steady and controlled. Angela Ruiz, calm and efficient, moved down the aisle, reminding passengers to check around their seats, ensuring overhead bins were closed securely. Her tone was professional, but softer than most pursers Amara had encountered. She wasn't simply delivering a script. She was tending to people. Across the aisle, Jonathan Park sat stiffly, his phone glowing in his hand. He had been sending messages nonstop since before descent. Now his fingers hovered, frozen, as though no words he typed would ever feel enough. As the plane taxied toward the gate, passengers whispered again, their glances darting toward Amara. Some whispered with awe, others with unease. Many were clearly rehearsing how they would tell this story once they reached the terminal. Already the legend of Seat 1A had been born. The aircraft slowed to a stop. The seatbelt sign chimed again. The sound of buckles clicking open filled the cabin. People reached for bags, pulled down coats, checked their phones for messages that had accumulated in airplane mode. Amara remained seated, still and composed. She did not rush. She never did. Jonathan rose abruptly, stepping into the aisle and approaching her with careful deference. His voice was low, urgent. "Doctor Sinclair, the press is here. Word spread during the night. By the time we pulled into the gate, there were already reporters waiting." And he hesitated. "Corporate is waiting, too. A few board members flew in early when they heard what happened. They want to speak with you before you even leave the terminal." Amara's gaze lifted to him, steady and unreadable. "Do you believe I am unprepared for that, Mr.?" Park Jonathan's throat tightened. "No, of course not. I wanted to warn you." "Good," she said simply, then reached down to lift her satchel. The passengers began to shuffle down the aisle. Some avoided looking at her, embarrassed by what they had witnessed and done nothing to stop. Others lingered, giving her small nods of respect as they passed. The woman from 2A paused briefly, whispering, "Thank you," before moving on. Even the man in 1B hesitated, awkwardly tugging his bag from the overhead before glancing down at her. "Safe travels, Dr. Sinclair," he said softly, his earlier smugness replaced by humility. Amara gave a small nod. "Safe travels," she echoed. Soon the aisle cleared. The line of passengers trickled out through the jet bridge, their murmurs echoing faintly back into the cabin. Jonathan gestured nervously. "Shall we?" Amara stood slowly, her satchel over her shoulder. She walked forward with deliberate calm, her steps unhurried. The hum of the engines outside had quieted. The only sound was the shuffle of the remaining crew preparing for their next task. At the doorway, Angela Ruiz stood waiting. She inclined her head deeply, her eyes steady with respect. "It was an honor, Dr. Sinclair. Thank you for showing us what accountability looks like." Amara allowed the faintest smile. "Thank you, Miss Ruiz. Lead with that same accountability, and you'll never go wrong." Angela's chin lifted slightly, her expression resolute. The jet bridge air was cooler, carrying the faint tang of fuel and metal. Amara stepped onto it, Jonathan close behind. Ahead, the glow of the terminal spilled into the walkway. Voices grew louder, the hum of commotion swelling. As she emerged into the terminal, the scene crystallized. Reporters crowded behind barriers, cameras flashing, microphones raised. Questions flew into the air like darts. "Dr. Sinclair, is it true you grounded the flight yourself? Do you plan to sue Aurora Air? Were you denied your seat because of racial bias? What happens to the crew now?" Flashes of light painted the space in bursts. Security officers flanked the walkway, guiding her with firm hands, keeping the press at bay. Amara did not break stride. She did not flinch at the questions. Her gaze remained forward, her step steady, her expression composed. At the edge of the gate area, a cluster of executives waited, men in dark suits, faces pale and tense. Among them stood 2 board members, wealthy, powerful, accustomed to control. Tonight, they looked like men awaiting sentencing. Jonathan slowed, falling slightly behind her, as though instinctively recognizing that this was no longer his moment. Amara stopped before them. She let the silence stretch, the cameras clicking behind her like an unrelenting metronome. "Gentlemen," she said at last, her voice calm but resonant, "shall we speak somewhere more private?" One of the board members, a tall man with thinning hair, nodded quickly. "Of course, Dr. Sinclair. The conference room is ready." They led her down a secured hallway, away from the cameras, away from the waiting passengers who peered through glass walls. Security cleared the path, the echo of her footsteps steady against the polished floor. Inside the conference room, the air was tense. A long table stretched beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Papers were scattered across it, hastily prepared reports, statements, contingency plans. Amara set her satchel on the table, remaining standing. She looked at the executives, her eyes sweeping across each one of them. "You've seen the reports," she said. "You've heard the recordings. But what I witnessed tonight was not a single failure. It was a system laid bare, a system that tolerated arrogance, that rewarded prejudice, that silenced the fearful. And if you believe for a second that this was an isolated incident, you are lying to yourselves." The men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting. "This airline is now mine," Amara continued, her tone sharpening. "And under my leadership, this culture will be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. Every complaint buried, every bias ignored, every cowardice excused. I want them unearthed and documented. Beginning today," her voice rose, not in volume, but in gravity, "we will not simply polish the surface while rot spreads beneath. We will cut out the rot, even if it means bleeding in the short term. Because I will not allow another passenger to experience what I experienced tonight. Not under my name, not under my watch." Silence fell. The weight of her words filled the room. At last, one of the board members cleared his throat, and, if the cost is high, if investors resist Amara's eyes locked on his, then they will learn what every passenger learned tonight. Accountability is not optional. It is the price of doing business. And if they cannot accept that, they can sell their shares and walk. The man looked down, his mouth tightening, but he did not argue. Jonathan Park, standing at the far end of the room, straightened slightly. For the first time that night, he looked almost steady. Amara gathered her satchel again, her expression calm. "You have your orders. Begin immediately. I will expect updates within the week." Without another word, she turned toward the door. As she stepped back into the hallway, the muffled sound of reporters waiting beyond reached her ears again. Their voices rose, eager, relentless. She did not dread them. She did not crave them. They were simply the world's echo, demanding what it always demanded answers, and she was ready to give them. The conference room door clicked shut behind her, leaving the board members in their uneasy silence. The corridor outside was bright, the hum of the terminal faint through thick glass walls. Ahead, the crowd was waiting. Reporters pressed behind barriers, microphones raised, cameras flashing in rapid bursts that painted the air in strobe-like pulses. Security moved to flank her, but Amara Sinclair raised a calm hand. "I'll walk on my own," she said. Jonathan Park's eyes widened. "Dr. Sinclair, the press they're going to. I know what they're going to do," she interrupted gently. "And I know what I must do." Her voice carried such steady certainty that Jonathan fell silent. He stepped back, watching her with a mixture of awe and dread. Amara adjusted the strap of her satchel, straightened her shoulders, and walked forward. Her heels clicked lightly against the polished floor, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the roar of voices as she entered the terminal. Doctor. Sinclair, why was your seat denied? Was this racial profiling? Do you intend to fire the entire leadership of Aurora Air? Did you really ground your own plane, mid-boarding? The questions surged, colliding over one another. Cameras flashed, each burst freezing her in sharp relief, a composed figure in tailored clothing, eyes steady, expression unreadable. She stopped at the barrier, lifting her chin just slightly. The room fell into a strange hush, the kind that only true authority could command. Reporters leaned forward, microphones trembling in their hands. When she spoke, her voice was clear, calm, and unwavering. What happened on Aurora Flight 418 last night was not an isolated error. It was a symptom of a deeper illness, a culture that tolerated arrogance, prejudice, and silence. A culture that put passengers at risk not by mechanical failure, but by moral failure. Her words hung in the air, sharp as glass. The cameras clicked frantically. I was denied my seat not because of a system glitch, but because of a judgment made on the basis of appearance, of assumption, of bias. That is unacceptable, not for me, and not for anyone who entrusts their safety and dignity to this airline. The reporters pressed closer, the flood of flashes turning the terminal into a storm of light. Let me be clear, Amara continued. This is not about revenge. It is not about humiliation. It is about accountability. The individuals involved have been removed from their positions not because of anger, but because they demonstrated behavior that no passenger should ever be subjected to. Their actions revealed failures in training, leadership, and oversight. Those failures end today. A murmur rippled through the press corps. Pens scratched furiously against notepads. Aurora Air will undergo a full audit of its policies, its training, and its internal culture. Complaints of discrimination that were ignored in the past will be reopened. Protocols will be rebuilt from the ground up. We will create systems to protect employees who speak out against wrongdoing. And we will ensure that every passenger, regardless of how they look, speaks, or dress, is treated with the dignity they deserve. Her gaze swept across the crowd, steady and piercing. If you are a shareholder who fears this level of accountability, sell your shares now. If you are a customer who demands it, I promise you your voice will shape the future of this airline. The question surged again. Dr. Sinclair, were you targeted because you're black? Do you believe this airline has a systemic racism problem? Amara's eyes did not flinch. I believe prejudice takes many forms. What I faced was one form. Others have faced different ones. What matters is not only naming it, but eliminating it. And that is what I intend to do. The flash of cameras grew relentless, but she did not shrink. Her voice remained even, carrying the same gravity that had held the cabin in silence hours earlier. I did not ground that flight for myself. I grounded it for every person who has ever been told they don't belong, who has been silenced, dismissed, or humiliated. And I will not stop until belonging is no longer questioned, but assumed. That is not just my duty as a CEO. It is my duty as a human being. A hush followed, deep and heavy. Reporters stood frozen, their pens suspended, their microphones trembling. Then the storm erupted, questions hurled, cameras flashing, voices overlapping. Security moved forward again, guiding her gently through the throng. Jonathan trailed behind her, his expression pale but resolute. He had witnessed not just a statement, but a declaration of war against complacency. As they moved through the terminal, passengers who had disembarked earlier lingered near the barriers. Some raised their phones to capture her. Others simply watched with quiet reverence. A few clapped softly, the sound hesitant but sincere. Amara did not slow. She did not bask in it. She simply walked forward, her stride steady, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Outside, dawn had broken fully. The early morning light spilled across the tarmac, painting the glass in pale gold. The city stretched beyond, alive with movement, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded in the sky hours before. Amara paused at the wide terminal windows, her reflection faint against the sunrise. For a moment, the weight pressed heavier, the exhaustion of always having to fight, of always being the one to bear the burden. Her throat tightened with the familiar ache of weariness. But then she heard her mother's voice again, the same voice that had carried her through childhood struggles, academic battles, corporate wars. You belong before you even step into the room. And she remembered belonging was not granted. It was claimed. Marcus Lane's voice echoed faintly from her phone, still tucked in her satchel. He would be waiting, ready with strategies, ready with plans. The fight was only beginning. She lifted her head, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward once more. The cameras followed. The questions trailed. The world leaned closer, and Amara Sinclair, in the glow of morning light, carried herself not as a passenger wronged, but as a leader resolved. As Aurora Flight 418 touched down in the pale light of dawn, the story was no longer about a seating dispute. It had become a living lesson in accountability. "Doctor." Amara Sinclair did not raise her voice. She did not trade insult for insult. Instead, she revealed what true authority looks like: calm, principled, unshakable. The crew who judged her by appearance learned the harshest lesson of their careers. Prejudice is not just cruel, it is costly. It rots trust. It poisons culture. And when left unchecked, it can bring down not just individuals, but entire institutions. Yet beyond the firings and the fallout, the heart of this story is not vengeance. It is humanity. It is about the silent passengers who began questioning their own complicity. It is about a young attendant who discovered the price of staying quiet. And it is about all of us who have witnessed injustice and wondered if we should speak. Amara's resolve reminds us silence protects the oppressor, not the oppressed. Respect is not a privilege to be granted. It is the baseline of human dignity. So, as you leave this story behind, carry its weight with you. Ask yourself in the next moment of injustice, will you stand silent or will you stand firm? If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you of your own power to make a difference, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice, consequence, and the moments that change everything. Because prejudice may board quietly, but together we can ensure it never takes flight.